Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Narwhals, Arctic Whales in a Melting World, a Loudoun County Public Library program with Todd McLeish. I'm Lorraine Moffa, Programming Coordinator at Loudoun County Public Library, and your host tonight. Feel free to send me any questions or comments you may have while watching the program by using the chat box, and I can relay them to the speaker at the end of his presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Todd McLeish is a Rhode Island-based science writer and has been writing about wildlife and environmental issues for more than 25 years. While earning degrees in communications at Ithaca College and Emerson College, he developed a passion for wildlife, natural history, and environmental protection. He immersed himself in the natural world by volunteering to help biologists with their wildlife research and began writing about these experiences. In more than 200 magazine and newspaper articles, Todd has highlighted numerous threatened species, profiled biologists and wildlife artists, and described encounters with a wide variety of backyard creatures. He has written 4 books about natural history topics, including Return of the Sea Otter and Narwhals, Arctic Whales in a Melting World. Todd is an expert birder, a frequent leader of natural history walks, a popular public speaker, and a former world joggling champion. Not juggling, but joggling. If anyone thinks they know what that means, let me know. We're all excited to hear about your experience with the narwhals tonight, Todd. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Lorraine. I appreciate the invitation to join you all, and thank you to everybody who's here on with us today. I love to tell my narwhal stories, so I'm just going to dive right in. I wrote this book maybe 8 years ago or so. No, maybe not that long ago, but nonetheless, it's been a few years, and I just had some wonderful adventures exploring the Arctic, and I'm going to share some of those stories as we go along here today. But when I first started, when I first started talking about writing a book about narwhals, the first question that my family and my friends asked was, "What's a narwhal?" Because, of course, an awful lot of people never heard of this creature, and even those that have aren't quite certain whether it's a mythological creature or something real. And so there was lots of uncertainty about even what the animal is. And so let's start and dive in and point out that, yes, indeed, this is indeed a real creature. We're talking about a whale that's about 15 feet long, so not large by whale standards. And it's got an 8-foot long spiral tusk. And that tusk is its left tooth. They only have 2 teeth in their mouth. Their left tooth grows 8 foot long in a leftward turning spiral. The right tooth goes nowhere. It remains impacted in the jaw. Neither teeth is useful for chewing or almost anything else. This is an animal whose name comes from the coloration on its body. You can see this animal is pretty much gray and mottled with dark and lighter colors. And narwhal in Old Norse means corpse whale, because it essentially looks like a floating dead body at the surface of the water. I'll show you some pictures of that a little bit later. And this is an animal which is very difficult to study. And that's why it's taken many, many years to really get a good handle on what's going on, its ecology and behaviors and so on. We still don't know an awful lot because this is an animal that spends so much time in the ice pack during most of the year. Now, this image is actually from an Arctic explorer's guide from the 1600s. And pretty clearly back then, they had no clue what this animal really was. This one looks like it's got scales like a fish. It's got a strange looking horn out of the top of its head. It's got a size, if you can compare it to the people on the bottom left. Clearly, it's out of proportion, and it's got those strange little wing-like things and an unusual wolf-like face. Clearly, back then, they didn't really know what a narwhal was. It was based on just a few stories. But even as late as the 1870s, when Jules Verne was writing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he described the narwhal as an animal whose tusk was designed to impale and sink ships. So even that late, there wasn't a great deal known about the narwhal. Now, here's where we're talking about. Here's the region where they live. If you can sort of picture or see the words Baffin Bay in the middle of that picture, That's essentially the southern extent of the winter ice cover. So everything north of that is totally frozen over in winter. And the narwhals spend that winter time right at the edge of that ice pack. So almost the entire world's population, about 80,000 narwhals, spends the winter right along the edge of that ice pack. And then as the ice retreats northward, the narwhals then follow that ice north in the late spring and early summer, and spend the summer months in the inlets and coves and fjords of northern Baffin Island and up near Connacht, Greenland, and a few other places, some of those other islands to the north of Baffin Island. There's a small population that spends year-round in the northern part of Hudson Bay. There's an even smaller population on the east side of Greenland. But for the most part, the bulk of the population winters in the middle of Baffin Bay at the edge of the ice pack, and then follows that ice northward to the coves and so forth of Baffin Island and the other Canadian islands and Greenland to spend the summertime. Now, keep an eye in your mind anyway. Keep an eye on where Pond Inlet is on Baffin Island and Connacht, Greenland, because we're going to go there in just a moment as we do a little tour around the area. So here's the corpse whales. Here's those narwhals in the middle of their winter habitat, floating at the surface of the water, looking somewhat apparently like a dead body. And this is really what their winter habitat looks like. If you were to fly over Baffin Bay in the middle of the wintertime, where all the narwhals are, you would see 97% of the area covered in ice. And then just 3% of the area has these little leads, these little openings in the ice where the narwhals spend their time, where they will surface to breathe. And it's here where they are diving down to the seafloor repeatedly all day long to find food. It's an hour-long it's a 30-minute long trip to go from the surface a mile down deep, down to the bottom, search around the bottom for haddock, for Greenland halibut, for Arctic cod, for some squid, maybe another species or two, but that's essentially all that they feed on, and then turn around and come right back to the surface and find an opening in the ice in order to take another breath. They do that 30-minute round trip about 12 to 15 times every day during the winter months. And the winter months up there basically are October through May. So it's a long extended period when they're feeding. And then they don't really feed at all during the rest of the warmer months of the year. Now, so I went on my first trip looking for narwhals to Pond Inlet on the northern part of Baffin Island. And, if you haven't been way above the Arctic Circle, it is a totally different world. It's a place where you're likely to see polar bear skins on your clothesline and not very many clothes. You're 400 miles from the nearest tree. That's how far above the tree line you are. But lots of beautiful tundra wildflowers. There is icebergs everywhere. This particular iceberg in the top left was about the size of a city block. And this tunnel in the middle of it could hold 6 or 7 school buses. It was a gigantic piece of ice. And the guide that we hired to take us to find some narwhals, he wanted to take us in his boat through the little tunnel. And I chickened out and said, please, please, no. And I think I was the smart one of the group because it was just a couple of days later that the entire thing collapsed in on itself. You do not want to have a chunk of ice the size of a city the size of a city block fall on top of you. And then finally we got to our camp. It was about a 6-hour boat ride from the village of Pond Inlet. And that's the picture of the camp down in the bottom left. And, it was just 6 of us there, and we were hoping for good sightings of narwhals. But the first 2 days, it was total rain. And, it was the middle of summer, so we had 24 hours of daylight, but it was also high in the Arctic, and it was pretty chilly. So cold rain, day in, day out for the first 2+ days. And then finally, at about midnight, we're sleeping in our tent, and my wife wakes up and she says, Todd, I think I hear heavy breathing outside our tent. And if you've paid attention to your Arctic wildlife studies, you know that the first thing to think about if you hear heavy breathing outside your tent is a polar bear. And so I did something that I will never live down. I told my wife to go out and investigate, and she did. And she came back a moment later and said it was not a polar bear. It was instead our first look at narwhals. And so it was a narwhal about 50 feet off the beach where we were camped with his tusk straight up out of the water. And it was a spectacular first sighting of a narwhal. And then a few other narwhals came by, and they all raised their tusks together in a behavior appropriately called tusking. And it was just a spectacular moment. In fact, so spectacular, the other couple that we were with, as pictured there in the bottom right, we all basically looked like the same thing. We were standing in the cold Arctic in pretty close to freezing temperatures, almost in our underwear, because we didn't want to take the few moments it would have taken to get back into our tents and get warmer clothes, because we would have missed something. It was an absolutely spectacular moment. But it also raised the question of, what's that tusk really for? Because that's the second big question that everybody always asks. What's the purpose of the tusk? And when you look at this picture, it looks like that tusk is really an aggressive device. It's really used, it seems like it's really used for aggression, for fighting, for defending oneself. And that's sort of what a still picture of tusking behavior looks like. There's actually 5 or 6 narwhals in this picture, if you count up all the tusks that you can see. But what really is happening, and what we could really tell very easily by watching them at our campsite, was that this is a gentle nuzzling behavior. It's really a bonding moment among the male narwhals. It's sort of like a couple of teenagers punching each other in the shoulder, just kind of bonding with your buds. And it wasn't at all an aggressive or defensive kind of activity. So when I asked the question of the biologist, what's the tusk really for? They said it is not what we traditionally think it's for. It was not for stabbing or for fighting or for aggression. It's not for digging in the seafloor to find food. It's not what Herman Melville suggested in Moby Dick. It's not a whale's version of a letter opener. It's not for skewering your food, because if you're a whale and you don't have any hands, how are you going to get your fish off the end of the skewer and into your mouth? It is instead what all of the biologists agree, they call it a secondary sexual characteristic. It's essentially the same thing as the lion's mane and the deer's antlers and the peacock's tail. It's an adornment that the males have to attract a mate. That's essentially what it is. It's really all those same things that many mammals in particular, but other animals have. When a male has an adornment that a female does not have, it is typically used to attract a mate. And of course, in this case, size matters. And so the animal with the largest tusk typically gets to mate with the most promising females. Now, it might also have a little bit to do with social bonding, social organization. That the large tusk is sort of the king of the hill and is in charge of maintaining social order among the group. But all the biologists agree the primary purpose of the narwhal's tusk is as a secondary sexual characteristic to attract a mate. Now, if you're a dentist, on the other hand, you might think about things differently. And there happens to be a dentist in Northwest Connecticut, right near the New York border, who studies not only human teeth, who actually has a regular family dental practice, but he has done a lot of studies of some of the more unusual teeth in nature, and certainly the narwhal's tusk qualifies as one of the most unusual teeth in nature. And he did some physical structural studies of the narwhal tusk. He held one up and discovered that it is flexible. If you can picture an 8-foot tall tusk that could actually flex about a foot in all directions. He also found that this is a very hard tooth, harder than human teeth, but what he called an inside-out tooth, because it was harder on the outside than on the inside. No, reverse that. It's harder on the inside than on the outside, which is the reverse of most mammalian teeth. And he discovered, when he put some slices of it under a microscope, he discovered thousands of what he called microtubules, little tiny pinprick holes that go through the tusk all the way to the middle. And if you can picture this long tusk, right down the middle of it is a hole that goes right down from end to tip. And there are nerve endings. There's fleshy stuff in there. The dentists call that the pulp. And what he discovered is that these holes, these microtubules, go all the way through the tusk into that fleshy stuff, into the pulp where the nerve endings are. And based on that observation, that dentist concluded that the narwhal's tusk must be more than just a secondary sexual characteristic. It must also be a sensory organ. He's not sure what it's sensing, whether it's something about salinity or finding food or pheromones from the females. He doesn't quite know just yet, but he's convinced that the narwhal's tusk is a sensory organ. Most of the biologists disagree vehemently. They think he's nuts, but he's convinced they are not. There's a bit of a debate going on, although they don't really talk to each other, and so we just sort of have to leave the debate at that, and perhaps the dentist will find some evidence, but he doesn't disagree that it is indeed also a secondary sexual characteristic. The biologists disagree about the sensory organ thing, because if it was a sensory organ important for detecting its environment and for survival, then the females would have one too, and they don't. So the debate will go on, but that's essentially what we know at this point about the purpose of the narwhal's tusk. Now, the third big question that everybody asks after what's a narwhal and what's its tusk for is, what is the narwhal's connection to the unicorn? Which on one hand sounds kind of curious because the unicorn is fake and the narwhal is real, but there really is a connection, because the unicorn myth has been around for more than 1,000 years. And for most of that time, it was believed that if you drank from a cup made from a unicorn horn, you would be healed of all your illnesses. It had some medicinal properties. And so everybody wanted one, of course, and there were expeditions around the globe trying to find the unicorn. Well, in the 1500s, when Europeans began to explore the Arctic, some of them came back to Europe with narwhal tusks. Whether they bought them or traded with the Inuit natives for them, whether they killed the whales themselves, whether they found them on the beach, nobody quite knows, but they came back to Europe with narwhal tusks and sold them as unicorn horns, and everybody wanted one. The Queen of England traded the value of an entire castle for one narwhal tusk. The Catholic Church ground it up into powder and put it in the sacramental wine to heal their parishioners. And the Danish royal family, this picture on the right is the Danish coronation throne. Every king and queen of Denmark has been coronated in that throne since the early 1600s, built, I believe, in 1609. And every vertical piece you can see there is actually a narwhal tusk, but it was constructed when they were believed to be unicorn horns. And so, again, a really great demand and interest in these because everybody wanted to find the unicorn. By the time the 1800s came along, one of those Arctic explorers finally brought back the entire whale and said, see, it's not a unicorn, it's a whale. And that convinced everybody that unicorns must exist. Because at the time, it was believed that if there is a land-based animal, it has a sea-based equivalent. So if we found the sea unicorn, then there must be a land unicorn somewhere, and that launched a whole bunch of additional explorations around the globe trying to find it. And as you can imagine, nobody found one. Nonetheless, that certainly ties these two animals, real and not so real, together nonetheless. So my second trip north to study narwhals was to this place. This is Qaanaaq, Greenland. I love the name. It's the same frontwards and backwards, Qaanaaq. This is a village of about 600 Greenlanders, a native Inuit who speak Greenlandic. My Greenlandic isn't very good. Their second language is Danish because Greenland is controlled by Denmark, and not very many people spoke English. So it was a challenge to get to this place. I mean, it was a challenge actually just physically to get there because it was 7 flights that took over 7 days. No, sorry, 7 flights over 3.5 days just to get there from Boston, and once you get there, it's there's only one flight a week in and out of Qaanaaq, Greenland. And so if you miss your flight, you are stuck there for another week, and you do not want to be stuck there for another week, because I was entirely fed during that week with 3 things: wonderful homemade bread, uncooked bacon, and raw whale blubber. I was very happy to get home and have a cheeseburger. But nonetheless, it's a beautiful place, and it's a place where people are the village is entirely subsistence hunters. They can't raise farm animals or grow crops because it's too cold. It's 35 below in the wintertime. It doesn't get much below 35 or 40 degrees in the summer. This is the northwest corner of Greenland. This is the northernmost municipality on Earth. And so these people, in order to feed themselves, they are polar bear hunters and walrus hunters in the fall. They're ice fishermen and seal hunters in the winter, and they are narwhal hunters in the spring or in the summertime. And it's a beautiful place to be. It's an amazing community that survives through this life, through these challenging conditions. And I was there to meet this guy. This is Mads Ole Christensen. He's the leader of the narwhal hunting community there in Connaught, Greenland. And he told me, and he's there, as you can see, this is a homemade kayak, a homemade paddle, a homemade harpoon. And if you can look over his right shoulder, little orange thing there, that's actually the buoy he uses to hold up, to attach to his harpoon, to hold up the narwhal once he kills one, in order to bring it to the coast. That buoy is made from an inflated seal bladder. Again, totally different world. But Mads Ole told me that narwhal hunting is all about waiting. It's about waiting for the ice to leave. It's 9 months of being iced in that community. It's then waiting for the narwhals to arrive in the community and then come close enough so that you can then launch your kayak and head out and paddle out with your kayak and throw your harpoon. It's a long waiting process to finally get to these animals. And of course, I was there not because I was interested in narwhal hunting, but because I wanted to learn about the importance of these animals to the Inuit communities there in northern Greenland. And so this, I think, is the best photograph I've ever taken. This is Mads Ole with his kayak, his harpoon in the air just before it struck and killed the one and only narwhal that they killed during the 3 days that we were in his Arctic hunting camp. And then 20 minutes later, he was there on the shore with that same animal, a 9-foot-long narwhal, maybe 4, 5, 6 years old, pretty dark in coloration, which would suggest it's a young animal. And then they proceeded to cut it up. Now, I got to tell you, this was the hardest part for me because, I've loved narwhals since I was a little kid. I did not want to see them killed, did not want to see them cut up. But it was important to understand the role of these animals if I was going to tell the story of the narwhal in a book form. And so I felt good that they used all parts of the animal. The head and the tail and the flippers were cut off and fed to the sled dog teams. The organs, the heart, the liver, the lungs were put in the good pile. The first thing they did actually was to cut off the first 1.5 inches of skin and blubber. That's called muktuk, and that is the delicacy. That's what you eat during a celebration for birthdays, for holidays, and other kinds of celebrations. It's what you eat for holidays. It is the delicacy, and so it's what you eat for after a successful hunt. Well, we had just had a successful hunt, and so everybody got this big slab of skin and blubber, and they score it with a knife in a checkerboard pattern so you can bite off little pieces of it, and it was gross. It was chewy, it was oily, it was, you felt like there was a bit of gristle in there, cartilage or something. You really had to chew it hard to get it to go down. And I chewed and chewed and smiled because, I didn't want to say no to their delicacy because my entire health and safety during that week was entirely dependent on these hunters. So I did my best. I got it down. I smiled. I said, thank you very much. And then they gave me another slab. Not a great time for eating for me while we were there. But nonetheless, he then cut up all the steaks, all the muscle, which was actually charcoal black before they even cooked it. All the blubber they saved, as I said, the intestines, the heart, liver, the lungs. That he even started to coil up all the intestines, yards of intestines. And I said, Mads Ole, what are you going to want to do with that? And he said, I don't know, but it was on my wife's wish list. In his little broken English, and it was pretty funny, but I didn't want to ask what she was going to use it for because I didn't want to have to eat it. Maybe it was going to be seal sausages or something. But nonetheless, what I learned from this experience was not only that these animals are very important to their diet, but also important in their dances, in their songs, in their carvings, carving of the narwhal tusk and bones. Lots of wonderful stories that they tell about narwhals. But most important, it's about their diet. Now, if you can imagine, there is no heart disease in Arctic communities that eat whale products because the whale oils provide so many omega-3 fatty acids and other beneficial nutrients that they have super healthy hearts. And on the other hand, these animals also have pollutants in them, and so they have to take the risk of that. But even the health department in Canada and Greenland say it's healthier for these people to continue to eat whale products to get the beneficial nutrients and take the risk of also ingesting the pollutants. It's better for them to do that than for them to eat what we eat, which is a lot of processed foods, which leads to heart disease. So again, very important to their diet and lots of other elements to the culture of these people. Now I went home and got home and was only able to stay there for 2 weeks because then I went back north again. And I went north to back to Pond Inlet to join these folks for a 3-week study of narwhals. This is basically a Canadian government research team studying narwhals high in the Arctic. And if you look at that picture, the guy holding the left side of the flag with his fingers up in the gray hat, that's the dentist, Martin Nuia. And on the left of him is the head veterinarian for the Calgary Zoo, and to the left of her is the head director of the Vancouver Aquarium. There's a bunch of government biologists on the right from Canada and some native Inuit in the front who are the boat wranglers and the guards, standing guard for polar bears. And it was going to be a spectacular, and it was a spectacular trip, but I was a little bit worried, having just come back from Greenland and eating a lot of narwhal, that we were going to be stuck eating an awful lot more of muktuk and other nasty stuff. But, you know, the guy who was in charge of this research expedition, the guy standing third from the right, Jack Orr, he knows how to throw a good research party. He flew in 1,800 pounds of food for us. We had two legs of lamb. We had steak and chicken, all that we could eat. He flew in 3 gas grills to help us cook this food. We had a case of wine. In fact, I had an entire case of Hershey bars all to myself. I couldn't have been happier. But we were sleeping on the ground in cold, rainy conditions for 3 weeks, and that was certainly a challenging part of the expedition. But nonetheless, the goal of this trip was to capture narwhals, to really get close up and to be able to attach tracking devices to them. And it was quite spectacular. I shot this video the very first morning that we were there. I woke up at 6 in the morning, still bright out for 24 hours of daylight. I was still in my tent, still in my sleeping bag as I shot this video, and we had 200 narwhals swimming by our tent, and it happened every 6 to 8 hours during the entire 3 weeks of the expedition. And it was amazing to see and to hear these animals approaching from a distance. It took 10 minutes for the 200 animals to swim by the tent. This video goes on for a while. So enjoy the little pictures of some distant narwhals coming by, but you get a sense of what these guys look like. Now remember, the objective of this trip was to capture narwhals so we could put tracking devices on them. And what happened was essentially we set up a net that extended from the shore 150 feet out towards the middle of the water, and that net hung down 25 feet into the water, so that when the narwhals would swim by, some of them would bump into the net, one would get entangled, we'd pull the whole thing to shore, we'd untangle the animal, we'd put a tracking device on, we'd take some health measurements, we'd release it back in the water. That whole process was going to take 20 minutes or so. Well, what happened, every 6 to 8 hours, we had all these animals come by, all these narwhals swimming by, and every single one of them swam right up to the net, noticed it somehow, detected it, went and right up the other side and continued on their way. Every single one missed the net. And then 6 or 8 hours later, they'd turn around and they would come in right back again, and they would all come right up to the net, go right underneath, and continue on our way. It was incredibly frustrating. We would all have to get our gear ready. As soon as we saw or heard the narwhals approaching, we'd get our wetsuits on, we'd get the boats ready, we'd get everything wrangled together, and then we would catch a narwhal. That went on for 2.5 weeks. At the end of that time, I had ran out of vacation time at my job and I had to go home. So the Inuit guys, they took me on their boat back to Pond Inlet. I flew home. While they were there, they picked up a new net, brought it back to the research camp, and within 30 minutes of setting up that net, they had captured a narwhal. And in the last 2.5 days of the expedition, they caught 6 narwhals. So it really ended up being a successful expedition for them. It just seemed like I was the bad luck charm. As long as I was there, they weren't going to catch anything. But ultimately, it eventually worked out. And here's some pictures they sent me later. You can see the whole group. There's one point in time where they actually captured 2 narwhals at a time. The dentist, the guy closest to the camera with the rope over his shoulder, he was doing his studies of the narwhal's tusk, trying to prove that that tusk is a sensory organ. But what you see in the bottom left is the real purpose of the expedition. That's a tracking device, a satellite tracking device attached to the dorsal ridge of these animals so that when they surface to breathe, the antenna comes above the waterline, it communicates with the satellite, just sort of like your GPS on your phone or your car, and sends a message back to the biologist's computer so that they could track from moment to moment exactly where these narwhals are. And they were able to track for 6 or 8 months the movement, the migratory patterns, the route that they take from their summering grounds to their wintering grounds, which will give a lot of information about the risks that they are facing. How many hunting communities do they have to swim by in order to get to their wintering grounds and back again? So really interesting. They're continuing these studies every single year. The last few years, I think they haven't actually caught any. Despite the fact that I was a bad luck charm back then, they actually did succeed in catching a number of whales, and they continue to try to do that. Now, the biggest challenge that narwhals are facing has everything to do with climate change, with the fact that the Arctic is warming faster than any place else on Earth, and it's warming very fast. Glaciers are melting, bringing fresh water into the Arctic Ocean, changing the salinity of the water. It's changing all sorts of other environmental conditions. It's changing where some of the fish are spending time at certain times of year. And that's really the threat that these guys are facing. Narwhals, there was actually a study by biologists of all of the Arctic marine mammals. 3 kinds of whales, 4 kinds of seals, polar bears, and walruses. And it was concluded that narwhals are the most vulnerable of them all to the changing climate because they're just not very adaptable. They're not very flexible. They eat 3 or 4 kinds of food and that's all. And, if those food items end up shifting their range and going someplace else, they're going to have a hard time. The narwhals are going to have a hard time shifting and changing their diet. Narwhals have very narrow definitions of what their preferred habitat is, and if the conditions are changing, that's going to put stresses on them. And so great deal of concerns for narwhals as they're facing the changing Arctic conditions up there. The other thing that's happening as a result of climate change, of course, is the ice is melting. And the ice is super important to protect narwhals to some degree. You can see the picture on the bottom left. That's a killer whale. That is the primary predator on narwhals. That's what eats narwhals in the wild. And yet they don't like to swim under the ice because they've got that big tall dorsal fin and it could get scraped and hurt and injured. And so they avoid the ice. And the narwhals spend 9 months of the year hidden in the ice pack so they can avoid the killer whales. But the ice isn't there for 9 months anymore. We're getting a shorter and shorter period where the ice exists. The more time there is no ice in the area, the more access the killer whales have to the narwhals. The same thing with commercial fishing. There is commercial fishing in the area. It's a short fishing season because of all the ice, but now we have a longer ice-free period, which means that there's a longer commercial fishing season, and the same species that the narwhals eat are what the fishermen are targeting, Greenland halibut and Arctic cod. The longer the ice-free period in the area, the more there's likely to be exploration for gas and oil and pumping of oil and those kind of resources. And so that's a threat, not only because of the threat of oil spills, but because of the threat of noise. And shipping brings an awful lot of noise to the area as well. Mads Oli, the hunter, told me that when he paddles his kayak, he has to make sure he doesn't splash very much because the splashing scares away the narwhals. Well, a little kayak paddle is going to scare away narwhals, and certainly the large ocean vessel noise, cruise ships and cargo ships and other things, and certainly the explosions involved in underwater exploration for oil and gas is certainly going to scare narwhals away from huge areas of the region. So again, all these things are climate-related, significant impacts, and it raises a lot of questions about the future and what the future holds for these animals. Now, before we go, I want to mention a few other animals that we saw and studied and learned about as we were there conducting my studies during multiple visits to the Arctic. The whale on the bottom right, that's a beluga whale, the only all-white whale on Earth, and that is the closest relative to the narwhal. It's the same size, about 3,500 pounds, about 15 feet long. It's got somewhat more normal teeth, we'll call them, than the narwhal's tusk, but nonetheless, these are two animals that evolved from a common ancestor about 500,000 years ago, and there have been recent discoveries of hybrids between the two. So they are definitely so that's a much more common animal in the Arctic because it is much more adaptable. It is likely going to do fine in climate change, at least for a while, because it has a much wider variety of food that it eats. It can withstand lots of different environmental conditions. It's in different kind of habitats, and so it's going to do just fine. On the bottom left, of course, is a polar bear, and you probably see in the news occasionally stories about polar bears and the threats that they're facing from the climate. They hunt from the ice pack, but if there isn't ice pack, then they are struggling to capture the seals that they want to eat, and so they're stuck on land for an awful lot longer period and struggle to find food on land. They really want to be hunting from ice rafts, and those are getting fewer and fewer. So they're certainly facing big challenges. The top right is the ringed seal. That's actually the primary food for the polar bears, and the ringed seal is the most abundant seal up there. I think there's last estimate was about 2 million ringed seals in the Arctic, but they are also somewhat threatened because they are what is referred to as an ice seal. They give birth on the ice, and they make a hole in the ice so that they can escape into the water when they need to, when a polar bear approaches, for instance. But if there's going to be more or less ice, then again they're threatened. Because of so many of them, and because there will be patches of ice that will probably survive the warming at least for 100 years or more, they seem to be a little more secure than a lot of the other animals. And then the top left, we have the bowhead whale, the one large whale, sort of equivalent to the right whales or the humpback whales we have here on the East Coast. And this is a monster. This is about 55-foot long animal, maybe 60 tons in size. That white chin patch is quite distinctive. And interestingly, this is the longest lived mammal on Earth. They've been known to live for more than 200 years. At least the scientists tell me that. They said that there was a bowhead whale that was hunted legally by Alaska natives in 2010, and when they cut the animal up to share it with the communities, they found a harpoon tip made of stone, which was last used. That stone harpoon tips were last used in the 1860s. And so this animal was probably hunted in the 1850s or 60s, which means it was probably a mature animal already, 20 years or more. And then it survived that hunt, lived for another 150 years, and then was hunted and killed in 2010. So clearly this is a very long-lived animal. I'm not sure what it is about Arctic and whales making animals live particularly long. Narwhals are long-lived animals as well. Maybe 100 to 120 years is what's their estimated lifespan. So lots of other cool animals up in the Arctic, and it was a blast to be there for the 6 or 8 weeks that I was there during my studies over the course of a couple of years. And this is my last slide, and I just want to be able to show you a picture of an entire animal. In order to see an entire narwhal in the water, you got to be underwater to see it all. And you can see a little bit of variability in the different animals in this picture. You can see that the tusk of the close-up animal is not quite halfway the length of the whole animal, and so that suggests that this is not a mature animal. It doesn't have the long, it's mature length tusk yet. Typically, a mature animal is going to have a tusk about half the length of their body. You can see some different colorations of these animals. The paler animals are older ones. The more mottled ones are younger. And in fact, if you remember, the one on the beach that was hunted in my earlier slides was much more charcoal gray almost all over, and that would be the youngest of them all. So the coloration gives a sense of their age. And the other thing that I was particularly interested in learning about was the physiological adaptations these animals have to living in the Arctic. They are living above the Arctic Circle for their entire life, where it is dark, where it is darkness in the for much of the year, for half the year. They are hunting for food under the ice in the middle of the winter time when it's super dark. They're diving a mile down when it's even darker. So lots of interesting adaptations they need. They've got a 6-inch layer of blubber all around their body to keep them warm. They have echolocation abilities, as all toothed whales do, to be able to essentially see in the dark without really using their eyesight. And they've got a collapsible rib cage and other things in their system that allow them to withstand the great pressures a mile deep. If you and I were swimming at the surface and then dove a mile deep, we would be squashed in an instant due to the pressures. This guy has an adaptable rib cage and other adaptations that allow them to withstand those pressures and rapidly changing pressures. So really, an amazing creature overall. And my last message for you all is one that I basically ask of all of the biologists that I interviewed, and that is, what's the future hold for the narwhal? And all the biologists basically said the same thing. They said, they're doing great right now. They are their numbers are strong. They seem healthy. We don't see a downward trend in their population numbers, and so we feel really great about the current status of the narwhal population. And then they said, but. And the big but is, of course, climate change. Is how are they going to fare in the next 25 years, let alone the next 50 and 100 years, as things warm dramatically and environmental conditions change. And so that's the big question mark. We don't really know what the future is going to hold in 100 years or more. We barely have a good feel for what's going to happen to them in 25 or 50 years. So that remains the challenge. Hopefully we can do something about the rapidly warming oceans and globe and try to figure out how to save these guys. But in the meantime, not a happy message at the end, but still, these are amazing creatures. They seem to know what they're doing and seem to be thriving now. Let's hope that they continue to do so. I hope you've gotten a little bit of education here, a little bit of an appreciation for the unicorn of the sea. I thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Todd. That was fascinating. What cool
thank you.
creatures.
Thank you. And I'm happy to answer whatever questions you all might have. So fire away.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have any questions or comments for Todd, please type them in the chat box. I'm sorry if I missed this, but did you say that they make a sound? What do they sound like?
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because I do usually mention that. It is they part of the sound when they are swimming by is simply the exhalation, which if you've gone on a whale watch, you hear these loud noise of them exhaling and inhaling as they surface. And so they certainly make that kind of noise. But they also make vocalizations as well underwater, some sort of communication. And in my book, I describe it as sounding like Old MacDonald's farm. It's squeaky doors and chicken clucking and sheep baas and all sorts of odd little noises that I put a hydrophone in the water where they were swimming and listened to them, and it was a spectacular cacophony of all sorts of noises. We don't know what they're saying. Is it all communication? Is it just other kinds of grunts and sounds they're making? Nobody really has a sense for that, but clearly underwater, you hear an awful lot of noises that these guys are making.
Cool. Have any narwhals been kept alive in captivity?
That's a really good question. It has only been attempted, I believe, twice. Once for that for a New York aquarium 100 years ago. Who was that? P.T. Barnum, who tried to set up an aquarium and a showcase for crazy animals in the 1800s. More recently, it was tried in the 1980s by the Vancouver Aquarium. They captured 3 or 4 narwhals in the Arctic, brought them to the aquarium, and all of them died within just a few weeks. And if you think about it, this is an animal that doesn't seem to be adaptable to an aquarium kind of environment, to a captive environment. This is an animal that dives a mile deep to find food. It's an animal that swims straight for miles and miles and miles and miles, and without turning around. It's an animal with a big long tusk that's going to, break and hit the glass wall of an aquarium. So this is an animal that doesn't seem to be receptive to that kind of environment, and also because it really isn't any effort right now to bring wild animals back into aquarium environments. There doesn't seem to be anyone that seems to have the desire to bring them into captivity at this point in time, anyway, and probably never will. So there have been efforts. None of them have been successful for more than a few weeks, and it doesn't look like there are going to be any more efforts to bring them into captivity.
So you have to go to Greenland to
So you
see
have
them,
to go to
pretty much.
Greenland
Yeah.
or northern Canada to see them. Yes.
I don't know if I could survive that diet. Do they
Exactly.
interact? Do they interact or compete for food with other cetaceans?
It's a good question. They do seem to be found in the same places that beluga whales are found, the white whale, and so there is a little bit of interaction there, but not. I don't believe a lot of direct communication or direct interaction. Although, of course, we do have some hybrids between the two of them. The other cetacean, of course, that they interact with is the killer whales who are trying to eat them. But they do have an interesting social life among themselves. So there are pods, small pods. They're typically, 6, 8, 10, 12 animals that travel together, and they're segregated by gender. So the males hang out, and segregated by age. So the males hang out with each other, the females hang out with each other and with their young, and the older guys hang out with the older guys, the younger guys with the younger guys. So there is a social dynamic like that for most of the year. But then they also do come together in large superpods, where, like when I saw them for that 200 swimming by, that was probably 6 or 8 or 10 smaller groupings that were all gathered together during the summer months to travel together and feed together.
Okay. Can you tell us about reproduction? How many babies at a time? Do the males have a tiny tusk at birth, or when does it appear?
Oh, can you imagine a tusk at birth coming out of there? No. So here's what we know, and a lot is still a bit uncertain, but here's what the biologists think. Narwhals give birth to one. We certainly know narwhals give birth to one calf at a time, about every 3 years. It's 1 year of gestation, 1 year of caring for the young, and then a year to recover until she gets pregnant again the following year. So essentially, they give birth to one calf every 3 years. Mating takes place off the coast, off the edge of the ice pack in the middle of the winter time. Then they have a year's worth of gestation, and so then the baby is born right in that same general area about April or May, before they then begin their migration northward to their summer areas. That group of 200 that we saw, certainly we saw a few babies. They were I described them in my book as little pink sausages. They had a little pinkish tone to them when they're just born, and then they turn a bit gray. But essentially, that's as much as we really know. A year of gestation, a year of caring for the young one, give birth in April, and the tusk doesn't begin growing for a year or two, and so they don't have a tusk to start with. And nobody's entirely certain how long it takes to grow the tusk to its mature length, but they certainly don't have it when they're born.
Okay, so I'm going to feed you a couple questions at once here. What about the beluga hybrids? Have they been seen alive? Are experts sure it's a narwhal beluga hybrid and not something else? And can they communicate with belugas?
Yeah, those are all good questions. It was 1985 when a live narwhal beluga hybrid was found. It didn't have the normal teeth. Well, I'm trying to remember what the specifics were. It did have some combination of coloration and physical traits that was representative of both animals. It was live, it was hunted, it was killed, and the skeleton is somewhere in Greenland. And then later, when we developed DNA technique, they were actually able to take DNA and confirm that it was indeed a hybrid. And then more recently, one was discovered. I'm not sure if it was dead or alive, but in the last few years. And those are the only two that anyone is certain of, that they were indeed narwhal hybrids. Whether they were able to reproduce, nobody knows. Whether they can communicate between the beluga and the narwhal and the hybrid, how all that works, no information about any of that is known at this time.
I guess because they're so far away, they can't be studied as much as some other
Well,
animals, right?
well,
Isn't
that,
that?
that is absolutely correct. Yes. So
Yeah,
they are high in the Arctic. They're mixed
right.
in within the ice pack for 9 months of the year. They're just
Yeah,
hard to access, and
yeah,
so
right.
scientists can't really get there very easily. And they're hard to capture to be able to do up close physiological studies of live animals. We can't keep them in captivity. All sorts of challenges having to do
Mhm.
with where they are that makes it hard to learn much about them.
Yeah. Someone's asking which was the mother narwhal or beluga?
I'm
Do you
sorry.
know?
Say again.
I'm not sure I understand. Which was the mother narwhal or beluga? Did you have a picture or something?
I'm
I'm not
I'm
sure.
not
April, if you,
sure.
you want to send me another question, I'm not sure I understand that. And someone's saying, so no females have tusks, just males. That's,
Well, no, that's not entirely true. So
oh,
every male narwhal has a tusk, and as I said, it starts growing after a couple of years after birth. Um, some males, and it's maybe 1 out of 500 males, actually grows a double tusk. That one tooth impacted in the jaw actually grows and becomes a second tusk. And so that is a spectacular sight to see. I've never seen one live, just skeletons and skulls of them. But so there are a few double-tusked narwhals out there. They would be males. There are females, maybe 1 in 1,000 female. That's probably more than that. One in 250 female narwhals actually will grow a tusk, a single tusk. It's thinner, it's shorter, but it is a tusk and it is a female. So certainly that does happen on occasion, but it is not certainly common among the population.
okay. Um, I missed the beginning, but wanted to mention I've spent lots of time in Nunavut in
Yeah,
the Canadian Arctic,
yep.
including several weeks in Pond Inlet. Unfortunately, I missed seeing narwhals directly because killer whales were in the area when I was there. Did you run into that problem?
I did, yes. My very first trip to the Arctic to study narwhals. You might remember the story I told about seeing our very first narwhal from the beach. Um, we were heading back to Pond Inlet, so our camp was about a 6-hour boat ride away. We were heading back to Pond Inlet, and as we stopped to have a sandwich on the boat, we saw about maybe 80 or 90 narwhals that were swimming very close, very, very fast. They weren't just tooling around and going slowly and just traveling. These guys were racing. And they zoomed right by us, and some of them went right under our boats. And it was amazing to see. And we realized very quickly why they were going so fast, because 30 seconds behind them was a group of 12 killer whales. We didn't see any interaction. We didn't see them kill anything, but certainly one, that was pretty spectacular just to see. I'd never seen a killer whale at that point in time. And two, that clearly was representing of what goes on in the wild when killer whales have access to narwhals. That is indeed what happens. And the narwhals typically scatter and don't come together back into their pods again until sometimes it's a couple days at a time. So, or even longer. So certainly killer whales around, you have a hard time finding narwhals.
Did you see a killer whale get a narwhal
I
in that
did not. No,
circumstance? Okay.
we saw we saw the killer whales chase the narwhals, but the killer whales were probably 20 or 30 seconds behind the narwhals, and we didn't see the end result.
Okay, I'm glad. Has there ever been a case of a narwhal using its tusk for self-defense? The tusk is flexible, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, there's been so few observations underwater of what they're doing that it's really hard to know exactly how they're using it. If they might use it for something else beyond what we know that they're using it for. In fact, there was so self-defense. No, nobody knows. Nobody's documented that in any way. Nobody thinks that's at all how it's used. But the one thing that was observed, a drone maybe 2 years ago flew over a narwhal pod and actually saw a narwhal. I've actually seen this video. Saw a narwhal use its tusk to slap at a fish at the surface to stun it, and
Oh,
then consume the fish. So that opened up all sorts of new possibilities of what it could be using the tusk for, beyond just to attract a mate. And so, was this a typical use of a narwhal's tusk? Was this just a unique narwhal that sort of learned this other behavior that nobody else was using? Is it more common among other narwhals? Nobody really knows. All we have is one observation of that behavior. So that sort of raises lots of new questions and things that are worth investigating.
interesting. Are there two-horned narwhals?
Uh, yeah, so I mentioned that the double-tusked narwhal, about 1 in 500 males, does have a double tusk. Does have a double tusk. The tusk actually goes out through their upper lip, and so the typical one is the left tusk. The left tooth grows through the upper lip out 8 feet in a leftward spiral, and then on very rare occasions, 1 out of 500 males, the right tooth does do the same thing, go through the upper lip and grow out as well.
What kind of information do you get from the tracking device?
So, I guess there's lots of different technologies. For the most part, it's just a GPS unit, or at least the one that they were using when I was there. It's just a GPS unit to identify exactly where is this animal at any given moment, sort of like your phone does, or like you have in your car. It tells you exactly where it is, because that's what they were trying to figure out. Where do these guys go? What route do they take from their summering ground to the wintering grounds? There are similar kinds of tags that can also have information about can gather information about depth, how deep do they dive, and how often do they dive, and all sorts of other data about the conditions that they're living in, the environmental conditions of the water, temperature and salinity, and those kind of things. But those devices then get a bit large and bulky, and they're expensive, and so they didn't use a lot of those. But the ones that we were using while I was there was certainly just for the most part, a GPS unit with a satellite tracking capability to send that GPS location to the biologists, to a website essentially, so the biologists can figure out where they are.
Okay. Was the mother of the hybrid a beluga or a narwhal?
I don't know. I'm not sure if anybody knows that, but certainly
Okay.
the one. Hmm. Yeah, I guess I don't even recall. I do have it in my book somewhere, the mention of that particular hybrid from the 1980s, and I probably have the information about whether was a male or female. So we don't know. I don't know off the top of my head whether the female was a beluga and the male was the narwhal, or vice versa, when they mated to produce this hybrid. Too little is known about that at this stage.
Okay. And if the tusk breaks, can it grow back?
I get that question a lot. Yeah, and that does seem to be something we think about in terms of regeneration. Some animals are able to regenerate, limbs, or starfish arms can do that. But no, so this is a tooth. And so just like us, if we break a tooth, it doesn't grow back. And so in fact, when we were trying to capture those narwhals, after I left, they caught two narwhals at the same time. Remember that picture in my program here? One of those narwhals actually had a broken tusk. And I'm sure it wasn't it was a little painful for them, just like when we break a tusk, but they get used to it after a while. The big challenge or change is, of course, they're no longer the king of the hill. If they had the biggest tusk, they no longer do. And so they sort of become a lesser member of the social group. But you break a tooth, it doesn't grow back. And that certainly is the case with the narwhals.
Okay, and I'm going to unmute one of our attendees to ask her question directly. Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, my question wasn't, I had read an article that said that the baby was called a narluga, the one that killed the mom and the dad and the baby, and that the baby had a tusk. So they said that meant that the dad would be the narwhal, the mom would be the beluga. So therefore they were called a narluga.
I have definitely.
They showed a picture of the mouth with a little tusk growing out, but now you just said that sometimes females have little tusks.
Yeah, I've definitely heard the reference to a narluga. Just there isn't an official term for it. People were just trying to create a fun name, and narluga sounded like the easiest combination of the word narwhal and beluga. Because there have been so few and so little is known about them, there really isn't an official designation of what to call them. But I love the term narluga. But yeah, maybe what you read about was the more recent occurrence that was discovered in the last few years. I don't recall the specifics of that particular incident, so it sounds like you know a little more about that one than I do.
It had found the skull up on the wall of the man's cabin. He said that he had killed the three of them, and he kept the skull because it was so different.
Wow.
And so I think that could be the older story.
Yeah. I guess I don't know the specifics of that incident.
But the thing that was weird was I didn't understand what it would eat because it had shovel-like teeth, and then it had a little tusk tooth. So they said it had a time eating because it wouldn't be like either parent.
Well, neither of them, the narwhal or the beluga, actually chew. I mean, the beluga has somewhat normal teeth, and that you would think could be used for chewing, but it doesn't. Both of these animals are suction eaters. They just slurp up their food. They find their food and they slurp it up and swallow it whole. So neither of them needs teeth at all to consume food. So that wouldn't necessarily help or hinder them if they had one kind of tooth or another kind of tooth or a combination of them, since both of them are suction feeders that don't chew. So the kind of teeth doesn't really matter in this case.
Thank you. This has been very fascinating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and that appears to be the end of our questions. So Todd,
Right.
Thank you again. Really appreciate hearing about these creatures. You're really lucky that you got to go to Greenland and see them.
I did have some fun adventures. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it, and maybe we can do this again.
Absolutely. Maybe we could have you back to talk about sea otters.
I'd be happy to do that. That's my most recent book, and I had some fun adventures with those guys too.
We would love it. Thank you all in the audience for attending. Hope to see you next time.